James Holloway sat on his porch in the pre-dawn darkness, a Winchester rifle across his lap, dried blood crusted on his temple. At 55, he'd thought he knew what dying meant. He'd been wrong. The rumble came first, distant thunder that wasn't thunder. Hoofbeats, not one horse, not 10, hundreds. His fingers tightened on the rifle stock. He'd earned this. 3 generations of debt, 50 years of guilt, 12 days of defiance, all converging at sunrise. Behind him, through the broken window, he heard them breathing. The Navajo widow, her 2 children, the family he'd given everything to save. A week ago, he'd signed over his best land to a stranger. Yesterday, the town voted him dead. Tonight, his own brother had come with torches. Now the horizon glowed red, and the earth shook beneath him. James stood slowly, rifle ready. "I deserve this," he whispered. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. James Holloway had heard the story 1,000 times as a boy. His grandfather, William, barely 20 years old, had wandered into the Arizona desert, chasing fool's gold. 4 days without water, lips cracked and bleeding, tongue swollen, the sun a merciless hammer against his skull. A Navajo warrior named Hashke found him collapsed beneath a twisted juniper. The warrior had only one water skin left, barely enough for himself. He split it evenly. Both men nearly died that day, but both survived. William pressed a silver bracelet into Hashke's calloused hand, stammering promises through parched lips. "I owe you my life." They never met again on his deathbed. William had gripped young James's wrist with surprising strength. "Pay my debt, boy. If you ever meet his people, you pay what I couldn't." And James had nodded, not understanding that some debts compound across generations like interest on a loan that never closes. Now, at 55, James lived alone on 640 acres of Arizona borderland. His wife had left 12 years ago. His dining table seated 6, but held only one dirty plate. At night, he talked to his horse, because the silence in the house pressed against his chest like a hand. The room his son had slept in remained untouched, toys gathering dust for 20 years. The bank owned most of his soul, $5,000 due in 60 days. His eyesight was failing from diabetes. The doctor said maybe 3 months before darkness claimed him completely. He'd tried to be good once. At 25, he'd fallen impossibly in love with a Navajo woman named Zanzibar. She'd taught him her language, laughed at his clumsy pronunciation. They'd had a son, Thomas, born in secret because the law forbade their union. But James had also married a white woman his family had chosen. When she discovered his other life, she'd given him an ultimatum he couldn't escape. Choose your real family or your savage whore. He'd chosen wrong. Zanzibar had looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only sadness. "One day you'll lose everything, then you'll understand what you threw away." Thomas had left at 20, taking his mother's name, refusing to speak to the father who'd abandoned them. The worst debt came later. James had been sheriff when the town demanded he clean out the Indian problem. One night, chasing shadows, he'd fired into the darkness at a fleeing figure. The body lay face down in the dirt. A 16-year-old boy, in his hand, not a weapon, a cloth doll he'd made for his sister. The boy's name was Hashke Jr. grandson of the man who'd saved James's grandfather. James had resigned at sunrise. His wife left him that same week, disgusted by his weakness and guilt. For 12 years, he'd lived with ghosts, the boy he'd killed, the son he'd lost, the woman he'd abandoned, 3 debts, 3 generations, one man who'd failed them all. The August sun was already brutal at 8 in the morning when James rode out to check the far boundary of his land. The section near the creek, his best grazing territory, though he rarely used it anymore, couldn't afford to keep enough cattle to justify it. His horse picked its way carefully along the dried stream bed. Water still flowed here, one of the few reliable sources left after 3 years of drought. That's what made this 40 acres valuable. That's what made it sellable. If he sold it, he could cut his debt in half, buy himself time. The smoke caught his attention first, a thin gray ribbon rising through the cottonwood trees. Squatters, probably, or drifters. He'd have to run them off before they settled in. James urged his horse forward, rifle loose in the saddle holster but ready. As he rounded the bend, he saw it a crude shelter made from scraps of canvas and broken branches. A pathetic thing, barely enough to keep out the wind. A woman stepped into view. She was thin, her dress patched and faded, her dark hair pulled back in traditional Navajo style. Her face showed exhaustion carved deep into someone too young to wear it, maybe 32. Her eyes locked onto his with an expression he recognized, not quite fear, but preparation for it. Behind her, 2 children emerged from the shelter. A boy, perhaps 8, already positioning himself between his mother and the stranger. A girl, younger, clutching a cloth doll against her chest. The doll hit James like a fist to the sternum. It looked exactly like the one Hashke Jr. had been holding that night. The same rough stitching, the same faded fabric. "We go," the woman said, her English broken but determined. "We go now." James couldn't speak. He stared at the doll, at the boy's defensive stance, at the girl's wide, frightened eyes. The woman, Nesba, he'd learned later, took his silence as threat. She moved to gather their few belongings, a burlap sack, a dented pot, a blanket so worn it was more holes than fabric. "Wait," James finally managed. She froze. He looked past them to the shelter, to the nearly empty sack of cornmeal visible through the open flap, to the children's hollow cheeks and dirt-stained clothes. "How long you been here?" he asked. Nesba's jaw tightened. 3 days. We leave now. No trouble." "Where's your husband?" Her face went carefully blank. "Dead. Your people gone?" "Scattered." The boy Kai, James would learn, tightened his grip on the stick he'd been holding like a weapon. His arm trembled, but he didn't lower it. The little girl, Ayasha, pressed closer to her mother's leg. She didn't make a sound. James realized she hadn't spoken at all. He should send them away. That was the smart thing, the safe thing. Harboring Indians on your land invited trouble with neighbors, with the law, with everyone who mattered in town. But he looked at that doll again, at Kai's desperate courage, at the way Nesba stood straight-backed, despite having nothing, despite being terrified, despite knowing she had no power here. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Pay my debt, boy." Zanaba's words followed. "One day you'll understand what you threw away." And beneath it all, the weight of Hashke Jr.'s body, 16 years old and holding a doll for his sister. "You can stay," James heard himself say. 2 days, I'll bring food." Nesba's eyes widened. Why? It was a fair question. James didn't have a good answer. Not yet. 2 days, he repeated. Then we'll see. He turned his horse before she could argue, before he could change his mind. As he rode back toward his house, his hands shook on the reins. At home, he went straight to the storage shed. He filled a burlap sack with flour, cornmeal, dried beef, a bag of beans, added a wool blanket from the house, some matches, a bar of soap. On the wall above his desk hung his grandfather's silver bracelet, the one William had worn until the day he died, the one Hashke had refused to keep, pressing it back into William's hand with words in Navajo that William never understood but never forgot. James touched the bracelet with one finger. The silver was cool and smooth, worn by decades of touch. "Is this the chance?" he whispered to the empty room. "Is this how I pay it back?" No answer came. Just the ticking of the clock and the weight of 55 years pressing down on his shoulders. He loaded the supplies onto his horse and rode back to the creek as the sun climbed toward noon. Nesba watched him approach with that same wary expression, ready to run or fight, depending on what happened next. James dropped the sack at her feet. She stared at it like it might explode. "For the children," he said. She knelt slowly, opened the sack, and her breath caught when she saw what was inside. Her hands trembled as she touched the flour. The blanket. Kai crept forward, eyeing James with suspicion, but unable to hide his hunger. Ayasha clutched her doll tighter. The resemblance to that other doll, carried by that other child, made James's throat close. "Thank you," Nesba whispered. The words seemed pulled from somewhere deep and painful. James nodded and turned to leave. But as he rode away, he looked back. Nesba had gathered both children close. They huddled together, a small island of family in an ocean of uncertainty. The little girl's doll dangled from her hand, swaying gently in the breeze. James touched his chest, over his heart, where an old wound had never quite healed. Maybe some debts could still be paid. Maybe some mistakes could still be made right. Maybe it wasn't too late after all. James returned the next morning with tools and fresh water. He didn't announce himself, just started reinforcing the sagging shelter with proper timber from his barn. Nesba watched him work for 10 minutes before she spoke. "Why you do this?" He drove another nail. "Shelter won't hold in a storm. Why you care?" James paused, hammer in hand. "Because I can—" It wasn't the whole truth, but it was all he could offer. She seemed to understand that some explanations took time. Kai emerged from the shelter, still suspicious but less hostile. The boy had eaten well the night before James could see it in the way he moved, with slightly more energy. Ayasha peeked out behind her brother, the doll pressed to her chest like armor. James worked in silence. Nesba eventually joined him, anticipating what he needed before he asked. Her hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who'd known hard labor. They moved in an efficient rhythm. Two people who understood work didn't require conversation. By noon, the shelter was weatherproof, not comfortable, but secure. "Thank you," Nesba said again. The words came easier this time. James gathered his tools. As he turned to leave, he noticed Kai standing near the creek. staring at something in the water. The boy's face had gone pale. "What is it?" James asked. Kai pointed. Just visible beneath the clear water was a pile of stones, deliberately arranged, a cairn, a grave marker. James's blood went cold. He knew what lay beneath those stones. He'd put them there himself 12 years ago, in secret, because the town wouldn't allow a proper burial for an Indian boy. "Someone died here," Kai whispered. James couldn't speak. His throat had closed completely. Nesba approached, saw the stones, and her expression shifted. She knelt, touched the water above the grave, and murmured something in Navajo. A prayer, maybe, or recognition. James walked away before they could see his face. He returned at sunset on the third day, unable to stay away. Some gravitational pull he didn't understand kept drawing him back to this place, to these people. This time, he brought coffee and sugar, small luxuries, but he remembered how his own mother had treasured them during hard times. Nesba accepted the gifts with a nod. This, to his surprise, she gestured for him to sit by their small fire. Kai watched with narrowed eyes, but didn't object. Ayasha sat close to her mother, valiant as always. "Your husband," James began carefully. "How did he die?" Nesba's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a small glass vial, half full of dark liquid. "Poison," she said flatly. "Slow poison. In 6 months he suffer." James took the vial, held it to the firelight. He recognized it, rat poison. The kind sold in every general store. The kind he'd seen to Silas Crawford buy by the case for his warehouse. "Who?" he asked, though dread was already forming the answer. "White men. Want our land. Husbands say no. They poison his food. We have no proof. No one believe Indians. Where was your land? North, near the silver deposits." She said it without emotion, but her hands trembled. "After he die, they come for me and children. Say we must leave or die, too. We run." "How long you been running?" 8 months. 8 months. Through summer heat and whatever winter they'd endured, with the 2 children and nothing but what they could carry. "The men who poisoned your husband," James said quietly, "they still looking for you." Nesba met his eyes. "Yes." Kai suddenly stood, pointing toward the eastern ridge. "Mama, light." James turned. Torches, multiple torches, moving through the darkness toward them. "Put out the fire," he said, already moving. "Now." Nesba kicked dirt over the flames. Darkness swallowed them. "How many?" James whispered. 5, maybe 6. Kai's voice was steady despite his fear. James recognized this. He'd seen it before as sheriff, land grabbers, claim jumpers, the kind of men who solved problems with rope and fire. "Take the children to," he told Nesba. "There's a hollow under the bank 20 yards downstream. Hide there. Don't make a sound. They won't. Go." Nesba grabbed both children and vanished into the darkness. James heard the soft splash as they entered the water, then nothing. He checked his rifle, positioned himself between the shelter and the approaching lights. His heart hammered, but his hands were steady. Some skills you never forgot. The riders came slowly, deliberately. 6 men, all carrying weapons. The leader was Garrett Boone, a man James knew by reputation. Boone hired out to men like Silas, men who wanted problems eliminated quietly. "Evening, Holloway," Boone called out. "Heard you got squatters." "Just me and the coyotes," James replied, keeping his voice level. "That's so." Boone dismounted, walked toward the shelter. "Mind if we look around?" "I mind." "Now that's unfriendly. My land, my rules." Boone's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We got business in this territory, tracking some runaways. Indian woman, 2 kids. You seen them?" "Nope." "Funny. Smoke was coming from this direction. I was cooking dinner." "Where's your fire, then?" "Put it out when I heard you coming. Don't like unexpected visitors." The other men had spread out, trying to circle him. James shifted his stance, making sure they all saw the rifle. "This doesn't concern you, Holloway," Boone said, his voice hardening. "Step aside. Can't do that. You protecting Indians now? Thought you were the one who killed that boy years back." The words hit like a physical blow. James forced himself to breathe. "I know what I did," he said quietly. "Won't do it again." Boone studied him for a long moment. Then he remounted his horse. "You're making a mistake. We'll be back." "I'll be here." The 6 men rode off, but James knew it wasn't over. Men like Boone didn't give up. They just changed tactics. He waited until the torchlights disappeared completely before calling softly into the darkness. "They're gone." Nesba emerged from the hollow, water streaming from her dress. Both children pressed against her sides. In the moonlight, James saw tears on her face the first time she'd shown such vulnerability. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why you risk for us?" James looked at the cairn in the creek, barely visible in the darkness, at Ayesha's doll, at Kai's frightened but defiant face. "Because someone should have," he said. "A long time ago, someone should have stood up." Nesba moved closer, searching his face in the dim light. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy something in her. "We have nowhere else," she whispered. "Nowhere to go." James felt the weight of that truth settle on his shoulders. These weren't just strangers anymore. They were his responsibility now, his chance at redemption, or his final failure. "Then you'll stay," he heard himself say, "for as long as you need." He didn't know yet how he'd make that promise real, didn't know what it would cost. But as he sat with them through the rest of that long night, rifle across his lap and eyes scanning the darkness for returning threats, James felt something shift inside him. For 12 years, he'd been dying slowly, alone with his guilt. Now, suddenly, he had a reason to stay alive. James rode home that night but didn't sleep. He sat at his desk as dawn approached, the ledger open before him like an accusation. Numbers didn't lie, and these numbers told a brutal story. Debt, $5,000, due in 54 days. His finger traced down the column. The land by the creek, 40 acres of prime grazing with reliable water, could fetch $3,000 if he sold to the right buyer. Enough to buy time, maybe enough to save the ranch. He looked out the window toward the distant creek, where a woman and 2 children huddled in a makeshift shelter on ground that should have been theirs all along. 3 voices warred in his head. The first sounded like the sheriff he'd been, cold and practical. "You can't save them. You'll fail like you always do. You're just delaying the inevitable. Remember the boy you killed? You can't undo that by playing hero now." The second voice belonged to the father who'd abandoned his son, dripping with familiar self-loathing. "You'll lose everything again, just like you lost Thomas, just like you lost Zanzibar. Everything you touch turns to ash." But a third voice, quieter, spoke with something that felt dangerously like hope. "This is why you're still here. After all these years of wanting to die, this is why you're still breathing." James closed his eyes. His grandfather's weathered face appeared in memory, death already claiming him, but his grip still iron-strong on James's wrist. "Pay my debt, boy. Promise me." Then Zanaba's face, heartbroken but not surprised, as she'd gathered their infant son and walked away. "One day you'll lose everything. Then you'll understand what you threw away." And finally, inevitably, the image that haunted every night, Hashke Jr. falling, the cloth doll tumbling from his hand, 16 years of life ending because James had been too quick, too scared, too certain he was doing right. 3 generations, 3 debts, 1 chance. The pieces suddenly fit together with a clarity that took his breath away. His grandfather's unpaid obligation, his own abandoned family, the boy he'd killed. They weren't separate failures. They were one long thread of accountability that had finally wound its way back to him. James stood abruptly. He knew what he had to do. At sunrise, he rode into town. The streets were already busy with morning commerce. People who'd known him for decades now offering cautious nods. He'd been one of them once, before guilt had carved him hollow. Preston Hayes's law office sat above the general store. The lawyer was a careful man, freed from slavery before the war and educated in the East. He'd come west to practice where a black man's competence might outweigh his color, though only barely. Preston looked up from his desk as James entered, and his expression shifted immediately to concern. "James, what brings you here so early?" "I need papers drawn up. A land transfer. Selling the creek property, that's smart thinking. Should help with the bank situation." "Not selling. Transferring 40 acres to a woman named Nesba." Preston's pen stopped mid-reach. "Come again." "She's Navajo. Got 2 children, no husband. I'm giving her the land by the creek." The lawyer set down his pen very carefully. "James, do you understand what you're saying?" "I know exactly what I'm saying. This is legal suicide. The town will crucify you. Your neighbors will draw up the papers." "Preston, that land is worth $3,000, maybe more. There's talk of underground water sources. The railroad might come through that route. She needs it more than I do." Preston studied him for a long moment. "Why are you doing this?" James thought of his grandfather dying with unpaid debts, of his son growing up fatherless, of a boy bleeding out in the dirt. "Paying what I owe, 50 years overdue." Preston sighed, pulled out fresh paper, and began writing. The scratch of pen on parchment was the only sound as the sun climbed higher. When he finished, Preston pushed the documents across the desk. "Sign here and here. This makes it legal and binding. No one can reverse this without her consent." James signed without hesitation. His hand didn't shake. "You're a better man than most, James Holloway," Preston said quietly. "Or a bigger fool. Time will tell which. Time's the one thing I'm short on." James rode back toward his ranch, the signed papers secured in his saddlebag. He'd made it halfway when he heard his name shouted from behind. He turned to see his half-brother, Silas Crawford, galloping toward him, face red with fury. Silas was 3 years older, 20 pounds heavier, and had spent his life accumulating everything James had lost: money, property, respect, and James's ex-wife. Though that was a prize that brought neither man joy. "What the hell did you just do?" Silas demanded, reining his horse alongside. "None of your concern. You gave prime land to an Indian squatter. You've gone mad. My land, my choice. The bank won't like this. You're using collateral land for charity." "The bank doesn't own that parcel yet." Silas's eyes narrowed. "Neither will your neighbors. You're inviting them onto white territory. Next thing you know, we'll have a whole tribe camping on our doorsteps." "Then they can go to hell," James said flatly. "All of them, including you." "Silas." His brother's face darkened. "You always thought you were better than me, the righteous one, the moral one. But you're just weak. You've always been weak." James nudged his horse forward, but Silas grabbed his reins. "You'll regret this," Silas hissed. "That land should be mine. Father promised—" "Father promised you nothing, and you've got no claim." What James didn't know, what Silas would never admit, was that his brother was drowning. 10,000 in gambling debts, owed to men who solved late payments with bullets. Silas needed James's land to sell to the railroad, needed it to survive, and James had just given it away. "Stay away from them," James warned. "Or what? Or you'll find out what I'm still capable of." Silas released the reins, but his expression promised this wasn't finished. As James rode away, he heard his brother's voice carry on the wind. "You'll lose everything." By noon, the whole town knew. James stopped at the bank to withdraw what little he had left. The manager, a thin man named Sutherland, intercepted him. "I'm calling your loan early," Sutherland announced. 30 days, or we foreclose." "You can't do that. The note says 60. "I can when the collateral becomes questionable. You've made yourself unreliable." James had known this would happen, but the reality still hit hard. 30 days instead of 54, the noose tightening. He rode home exhausted, the weight of what he'd set in motion pressing down on him. As he crested the hill overlooking the creek, he stopped. Nesba and the children were by the water. Kai was teaching Ayasha something: how to catch minnows with her hands. Patient and gentle, their laughter carried faintly on the breeze. Nesba watched them with an expression of such fierce love it made James's chest achy. For a moment, the world was just simple joy. Children playing, a mother protecting, life continuing despite everything. Tears blurred James's vision. Nesba looked up and saw him. She walked slowly up the slope, leaving the children to play. When she reached him, she didn't speak. Instead, she placed her hand over her heart, then extended it toward him. Then she pointed to the children and back to her heart. The gesture said everything the words couldn't. "I see what you're doing. I understand the cost. You're giving us everything." James nodded, unable to speak. Some things were worth more than money, worth more than reputation, worth more than safety. As he watched Kai and Ayasha splash in the creek, their childhood briefly restored, James felt something he hadn't experienced in 12 years. Purpose. He'd protect them, no matter what it cost, even if it cost everything. James rode to the creek the next morning with the papers folded in his coat pocket. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs. What he was about to do would change everything, and there was no going back. Nesba was tending the fire, stirring something in the dented pot. She looked up as he approached, her expression cautious. Kai stood immediately, positioning himself protectively. Ayasha peeked from behind her mother, clutching that ever-present doll. James dismounted and pulled out the papers. "These are for you." Nesba wiped her hands on her dress and approached slowly. She took the document, staring at the official seals and neat handwriting with evident confusion. "What this?" "Deed. Legal papers. This land 40 acres from the creek to that ridge line, it's yours now. Forever." She looked up sharply, searching his face for the trick. "I not understand." James pointed to the boundary markers he'd noted on the simple map Preston had drawn. "This land belongs to you, not borrowed, not temporary. Yours. The law recognizes it." "Why?" The word came out broken. "Why you do this?" "Because someone once saved my grandfather's life, and I—" His voice caught. "I owe your people more than land, more than I can ever repay." Nesba's hands began to tremble. The papers shook. This real?" "Yes." She dropped to her knees. The papers clutched to her chest. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Kai rushed to her side, alarmed, but she was crying with something beyond grief, relief, disbelief, hope that hurt, because hoping had become dangerous. She pressed her palm flat against the earth, then looked up at the sky and spoke in rapid Navajo, a prayer. James understood, though he couldn't translate the words. A prayer of gratitude to forces he'd stopped believing in long ago. Kai stared at James with new eyes. "This ground, ours, yours. No one take it. Not if I'm breathing, and after I'm gone, the law protects it." Ayasha approached slowly, still clutching her doll. She reached up and touched James's hand with her small fingers. The gesture was so gentle, so trusting, that James had to look away before his composure shattered. "There's water here," he said roughly. "Good water underground. You'll be safe." Nesba rose unsteadily to her feet. She moved toward James, as if approaching something holy and terrifying. Then she placed both hands over her heart and extended them toward him. Her eyes brimmed with tears she no longer tried to hide. "You save us," she whispered. "You save my children." "Someone should have," James replied, "a long time ago." That evening, James learned the town had called an emergency meeting. He attended because running would accomplish nothing. The community hall was packed 50, maybe 60 people, all of whom had known him for decades. Their faces ranged from confusion to outrage. Silas stood at the front, orchestrating the proceedings like a maestro of moral indignation. "This isn't about charity," Silas announced to the crowd. "This is about property values, about safety, about protecting what we've built." A chorus of agreement rippled through the room. "She's a squatter," someone shouted. "Indians bring trouble." Another voice called out, "What about our families? Our children?" James stood in the back, arms crossed, watching the performance. This was fear, dressed up as righteousness. He'd seen it before, worn it himself once. Silas's gaze found him across the crowd. "My brother has made an unstable decision. I propose we vote to revoke this transfer on the grounds of mental incompetence." "You can't do that," James called out. "The papers are legal." "Legal doesn't mean right," Silas countered. "I'm asking for a vote, all in favor of expelling this woman and her children from our territory within 48 hours. Hands rose throughout the room. James counted them with a sinking heart. 45. Only 5 abstained. The gavel came down. Motion carries. James pushed through the crowd toward the front. People parted for him, but their faces were closed, judgmental. Friends of 30 years wouldn't meet his eyes. "You have no authority to override legal papers," James said, his voice carrying despite the hostile murmurs. "We have community standards," Silas replied, "and you violated them." "She has children. Where do you expect them to go?" "That's not our concern. You made this problem." "James, you fix it?" "I am fixing it. That's what giving her the land means." "Then you're choosing Sid's, and you won't like the consequences." The sheriff, a man named Wade, who owed Silas money, stepped forward. "I can't protect you any more, Holloway. You're on your own." James looked around the room at faces he'd known half his life. People he'd helped during hard times. Neighbors who'd shared meals at his table when his wife was still alive, and his house felt like a home. None of them would help him now. "If that's how it is," James said quietly, "then so be it. But if any of you come for her, you come through me first." He walked out into the night behind him. The murmurs swelled to angry conversation. He'd just declared himself an enemy to everyone he'd ever known. What James didn't see was Silas remaining after the meeting ended, gathering a smaller group of men in the shadows. Garrett Boone was there, along with 5 others whose loyalty could be bought. "He's forcing my hand," Silas told them, his voice tight with desperation he couldn't quite hide. "That land was promised to me. It should be mine." What none of them knew was that Silas had 10 days left before the men he owed would come collecting. 10 days to produce $10,000 or face consequences that made death seem merciful. He needed James's ranch, all of it, and James had just given away the most valuable piece. "We move tomorrow night," Silas said. "Burn them out. Make it look like an accident. James will be ruined, and I'll buy the rest of the property from the bank at foreclosure prices." Garrett Boone studied him. "And if James gets in the way—" Silas's jaw tightened. Something in his face hardened. The last vestige of brotherly affection dying in real time. "But then he gets in the way. Do what needs doing." The men nodded. They'd done worse for less money. In his mansion on the hill, Silas poured himself whiskey with shaking hands. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, 58 years old, successful by every measure that mattered, and drowning anyway. He'd been better than this once, hadn't he? Before the gambling, before the debts, before fear had eaten away everything good. "I'm sorry, James," he whispered to the empty room. But sorry wouldn't save him. Only money would do that. He drained the whiskey and poured another. Meanwhile, James sat with Nesba and the children by their fire. He'd brought blankets, more food, ammunition, preparing for the siege he knew was coming. Kai had finally relaxed enough to ask questions. How did planting work? What made good soil? Could James teach him to track? Ayasha fell asleep against James's side, her doll tucked under her chin, the weight of her small body, the trust implicit in her surrender to sleep, broke something open inside him. Nesba watched with eyes that understood more than James wanted to admit. "You have family somewhere?" she asked quietly, careful not to wake Ayasha. "Had a son once, made bad choices, lost him. He's still alive. Don't know. He left 20 years ago. never looked back. Then maybe he'd come back one day, maybe not too late. James shook his head. Some things can't be followed. You fixed us, Nesba said simply. We broken, you fix. She reached across the fire and squeezed his hand once. Then she gathered Ayasha and carried her daughter into the shelter. James sat alone under the stars, rifle across his lap. He could feel the storm gathering. Tomorrow, maybe the day after, Silas would make his move, and James would be ready. Even if being ready meant dying, at least he'd die for something that mattered. At least this time he'd stand his ground. The attack came at midnight. James heard them before he saw them, the thunder of hooves, the shouts of men emboldened by darkness and numbers. He'd been sleeping in the barn, unable to rest in his empty house, positioning himself between the main ranch and the creek. He grabbed his rifle and ran. 7 riders circled the shelter, torches blazing. Celeste sat at the center on his black stallion, face hidden in shadow. Garrett Boone and his men had already dismounted, pouring lamp oil around the perimeter. "Stopped!" James shouted, leveling his rifle. Silas turned slowly. "Go home, brother. This doesn't concern you anymore." "The hell it doesn't." Nesba appeared in the shelter opening. Both children pressed behind her. Her face showed no surprise, only grim resignation. She'd been expecting this. "Last chance," Silas said. "Sign the land back over, and we leave them be." "Never!" "Then you're choosing them over your own blood, over your own survival." James fired into the air. The crack echoed across the valley. "Next one won't be a warning." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Garrett threw his torch. The old canvas shelter erupted in flames. The dry wood underneath caught immediately, sending up a wall of heat and light. Everything Nesba owned, the few clothes, the blankets James had given them, the pot they cooked in, all of it burning. Kai screamed. Ayasha buried her face in her mother's dress. James fired again, this time at Garrett's feet. The man jumped back, cursing. The other riders pulled their own weapons, but Silas raised a hand. "Not here, not now. We've made our point." "We'll be back," Garrett promised, staring at James. "And next time, no mercy." They rode off, leaving the shelter blazing like a funeral pyre. James rushed to Nesba. "Anyone hurt?" She shook her head, but her eyes reflected the flames with a deadness that frightened him. Kai was crying openly. All his brave defenses shattered. Ayasha trembled violently, shock setting in. "Come to the house," James said. "All of you. Now." They gathered what little remained, nothing but the clothes they wore and Ayasha's doll. Somehow seared. As they walked away from the burning shelter, Nesba looked back once. Her husband's last possessions. The few items she'd carried for 8 months, all reduced to ash. She didn't cry. She was beyond crying. The next morning brought worse news. James rode into town to confront Silas, and found instead a notice nailed to the sheriff's door. His name, in bold letters, accused of harboring fugitives, reckless endangerment, and violation of territorial settlement laws. The charges were fabricated, but they didn't need to be real. They just needed to be official. Sheriff Wade arrested him before noon. The cell was small and cold, smelling of old sweat and despair. Through the barred window, James could see townspeople passing, deliberately not looking his direction. Silas visited at sunset. "You've lost," his brother said without preamble. "The bank foreclosed this morning. You have 21 days to vacate. I've already arranged to purchase the property at auction. You're destroying me for land you don't need." Something flickered in Silas's eyes. Pain, maybe regret, but it vanished quickly. "I need it more than you know." "For what? You've got more money than God had," Silas corrected quietly. Then louder, "This is business, James. Nothing personal. Everything is personal." After Silas left, James sat in the darkness and felt the walls closing in, not just the cell walls, but the walls of his entire life. Every choice, every failure, every moment of weakness had led him here. He'd killed an innocent boy, abandoned his son, betrayed the woman he loved, and now, trying to do one good thing, he was destroying even that. The voices returned, louder than ever. "You're not saving them. You're killing them, just like you kill everything you touch. Your son was right to leave. You weren't worth staying for. Die. Just die. Stop making things worse." They released him after 24 hours, but the damage was done. When James returned to his ranch, he found devastation waiting. The barn door hung open, cattle scattered or stolen. His storage shed had been ransacked, food supplies gone. Someone had poisoned the well. He could smell it before he saw the dead rats floating in the water. Nesbah and the children huddled in his house, terrified and helpless. "They came while you were gone," she said. "Many men. They take everything." James walked through his property in a daze. Everything he'd built over 30 years, systematically destroyed in a single day. The financial calculations were simple and brutal. He had nothing left, no assets to sell, no way to pay the debt. In 20 days, the bank would take it all, and Silas would own it. And Nesbah would lose her land because James wouldn't be alive to defend it. That night, after Nesbah and the children finally slept, James took his pistol and walked to the barn. He'd thought about this before many times over the past 12 years, but had always found a reason to keep breathing. Now he couldn't think of one. He sat in the hay back against the wall and pulled out paper to write. His hand shook so badly the words barely formed. "Nesbah, I'm sorry I failed you. I fail everyone. You'll be better off without me dragging you down. Preston Hayes has documents that prove the land is yours. Show them to the court. Maybe without me in the way, they'll leave you alone. Tell the children I tried to tell them he couldn't finish. What was there to tell? That their protector was a coward, that the man they trusted couldn't even protect himself." James loaded the pistol with steady hands. This, at least, he could do right. He placed the barrel under his chin and closed his eyes. His finger tightened on the trigger. One pull, 1 second, then peace. No more failing, no more disappointing everyone who counted on him. "Please, God," he whispered, "let this be enough. Let my death be worth something." He pulled the trigger halfway. A small hand touched his arm. James's eyes flew open. Ayesha stood beside him in her nightgown, the doll hanging from her other hand. She'd made no sound approaching, just materialized like a ghost. She didn't speak, she'd never spoken, not once. But her eyes held his with an intensity that froze him completely. Slowly, never breaking eye contact, she sat down beside him. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Her small hand found his free hand and held it. They sat in silence. The little girl and the broken man, the gun still pressed under James's jaw, his finger still on the trigger, but he couldn't pull it. Not with her here, not with her trust wrapping around him like a physical thing, not with her silence saying everything that mattered. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time became meaningless. Finally, James lowered the gun. His hands were shaking again, but for different reasons. He wrapped his arm around Ayasha and pulled her close, and the dam inside him broke. He wept, great, wrenching sobs that tore from somewhere deep and primal. All the grief he'd held for 12 years came pouring out for his son, for Zaneba, for Hashke Jr., for the man he'd tried to be and failed to become. Ayasha didn't move. She just held his hand and let him break. When dawn came, James was still alive, still broken, still defeated, still facing impossible odds. But Ayasha had fallen asleep against him, her doll, tucked between them. James looked down at her peaceful face and felt something shift. If he died, who would protect her? Who would stand between these children and the men with torches? He'd failed before. Failed his son. Failed Hashke Jr. Failed everyone who'd ever counted on him. But maybe, just maybe, he could fail better this time. Maybe staying alive, even in defeat, was braver than dying. He carried Ayasha back to the house and tucked her into bed beside her brother. Nezba was awake, watching from the doorway. Her eyes traveled from the gun in James's belt to his tear-stained face, and she understood everything without asking. She crossed the room and embraced him, not romantically, but as one survivor recognizing another. "We fight," she whispered. "Together, we fight until we cannot fight." James nodded against her shoulder. He didn't know how they'd survive, didn't know how to beat men with money and weapons and the law on their side. But he'd learned something in that barn. Sometimes courage wasn't about winning. Sometimes it was just about refusing to quit, even when quitting made more sense. The sun rose on their impossible situation, and they faced it together on the second day after the barn. James made a decision. If he was going to fight, he needed allies. And there was only one group who might understand what he was trying to do. He rode to find Preston Hayes, who directed him to a trader named Marcus Running Bear, a Lakota man who maintained relationships with multiple tribes, including the Navajo. "I need you to carry a message," James told him, "to Nezba's people." Marcus studied him with dark, unreadable eyes. "The Navajo don't forget, Holloway, neither kindness nor murder. I know what I did. Tell them anyway. What's the message? Tell them Nezba needs protection. Tell them James Holloway is paying the debt of William Holloway." He paused. "Tell them Hashke's debt is settled." Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly. "You know that name. My grandfather owed him everything. I owe his people more. It'll take 2 days for them to arrive, if they come at all." "They'll come," James said, with more confidence than he felt. "They have to." That night, as James sat with Nezba by the fire, teaching Kai how to clean a rifle properly, she suddenly stood and went into the house. She returned carrying something wrapped in cloth. "I show you something," she said quietly. "Something I keep hidden." She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a silver bracelet, old and worn. James's heart stopped. It looked exactly like his grandfather's bracelet, the one hanging on his wall. My grandmother give me before she die, Nesba explained. She say white man give her husband long ago. Man named William. James's hands trembled as he took the bracelet. Inset, engraved in flowing script, William Holloway, Rechtinor, and below it Hashke, brother of my soul. Your grandmother, James whispered. Hashke was your grandfather? Nesba nodded. I am his blood. My father was his son. My uncle, her voice caught. My uncle was boy named Hashke Jr. 16 when he died. The world tilted. James felt his vision narrow, his breath coming in short gasps. The boy I killed was your uncle, yes, and you knew this whole time. You knew. I know your face, but my grandmother, she described the sheriff who killed her grandson. I know when you find us. Then why? James couldn't finish. Why did you let me help you? Why did you trust me? Why didn't you hate me? Nesba took the bracelet back and placed it in his hands, because grandmother also tell me about William, about mercy he received. She say maybe one day his family pay what he owe. Maybe they remember. She met his eyes. You remember? You pay? James was crying again, something that seemed to happen too easily now. I killed your uncle. I destroyed your family. You also save my children. You give us land. You stand against your own people. She touched his face gently. Grandmothers say, Hashke, always believe good people exist. Even when hard to see, you make him right. Before James could respond, a figure emerged from the darkness beyond the firelight. A young man, perhaps 35, wearing traditional Navajo clothing, but moving with the confident stride of a warrior. Kai jumped up, positioning himself protectively. James reached for his rifle. Peace, the man said in perfect English. I'm not here to fight. There was something familiar about him, the shape of his jaw, the way he carried himself. James's breath caught. Thomas! The man stopped. A muscle worked in his jaw. That's not my name anymore. I'm called Hastien Tonei now. Yet James stood slowly, his son's face before him for the first time in 20 years. Thomas had been 18 when he left, angry and hurt. Now he was a man, weathered by sun and experience, but unmistakably James's child. What are you doing here? James asked. Marcus Running Bear told the tribe about your message. I came ahead to see if it was a trap. A trap. The white man who abandoned his half-breed son suddenly wants to help Indians. Thomas's voice was bitter. Forgive me for being suspicious. I didn't know you were with the Navajo. Where else would I go? The white world wanted nothing to do with me. My mother's people took me in, made me one of them. He gestured to Nesba and the children. I came to watch the man who threw me away, to see if he'd betray them too. Thomas, that's not my name, he repeated sharply. Then his voice softened slightly. But I've been watching for 3 days. I saw you burn your life down to protect them. Saw you nearly eat a bullet in that barn. He looked at Ayesha, sleeping peacefully nearby. I saw her save you. The two men stood 5 feet apart, an ocean of pain between them. I don't expect forgiveness, Kita, James said. I don't deserve it. But they do. They deserve help. Thomas nodded slowly. That's why I'm here. The tribe is coming. They'll arrive at dawn. How many? Enough. James wanted to say more, wanted to bridge the 20 years with the words that might matter. But Thomas turned away. "Get some rest, old man. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He disappeared into the darkness as silently as he'd come. James stood staring after him. Another piece of his past returned to haunt him. Nesba touched his arm. "Your son?" "Yes. He come back. That means something. Means he wants to see if I'll fail again." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe he want to see if you finally succeed." James didn't sleep that night. He sat on his porch with his rifle, watching the eastern horizon and waiting. His whole life had led to this moment, all the mistakes, all the guilt, all the years of lonely suffering. The calculation was simple now. Silas would come at dawn with his men. 20, maybe 30 riders, all armed, all willing to kill. James was one man, one old, half-blind man with diabetes and a death wish he'd barely talked himself out of. But he wouldn't run, wouldn't hide, wouldn't let them take Nesba's land without a fight. If he died, at least he'd die for something real. The sky began to lighten. Gray became pink, became gold. James stood, checked his rifle one more time, and waited, right on schedule. He heard them coming. Silas and his riders appeared from the west, 23 men with weapons drawn. They fanned out in a semicircle surrounding the property. Silas looked terrible. His face was drawn, his hands shaking, a man staring at his own end and willing to do anything to escape it. Last chance. "James, you've already said that." "My answer hasn't changed." "Then you're a fool." "Been called worse." Silas raised his hand, ready to signal the attack. James cocked his rifle, knowing he'd get maybe 3 shots before they overwhelmed him. This was it, the end. Then the ground began to shake. At first, James thought it was an earthquake, but the rumbling had rhythm, the rhythm of hooves, hundreds of hooves. From the east, silhouetted against the rising sun, riders appeared, not 20, not 30, hundreds. Warriors on horseback, riding in formation, the dawn light turning them into shadows with fire behind them. They made no sound except the thunder of their approach, no war cries, no weapons raised, just silent, overwhelming presence. Silas's men turned their horses, suddenly uncertain. Garrett Boone's face went pale. The Navajo riders spread out, forming a massive circle around Nesba's 40 acres. They didn't attack, didn't threaten, just stood witness. An immovable wall of human determination. An older man dismounted and walked forward. He moved with the dignity of age and authority. Hasti and So, the tribal elder. Behind him, Thomas also dismounted, standing at the elder's right hand. Hasti and So approached James and studied him for a long moment. Then he pulled out papers, old yellow documents. "This land," he said in careful English, "belonged to our people. Taken by force in 1847. We have proof, original deed. It was stolen." James felt the ground disappear beneath him. His grandfather, his father, himself. 3 generations living on stolen land. We could take all of it back. Hasti and So continued. "All your ranch. The law would support our claim." James nodded slowly. "I understand. But we won't." James looked up sharply. "Because you returned what was taken. Not just land, dignity, humanity." Hasty and So gestured to Nesba. "You protected our daughter when you had no reason to. You destroyed yourself to keep her safe. Another warrior stepped forward, older, his face scarred by time and hardship. He removed his bracelet and offered it to James. It was the matching pair to his grandfather's, engraved inside William Holloway, brother, and below Thomas Holloway Jr., son remembered. James stared at the name. You kept track of my son. We found him when you abandoned him, the old warrior said. Gave him a home, a name, a family, the things you should have given. James looked at Thomas, who stood rigid, refusing to meet his father's eyes. Your grandfather's debt is paid, Hastinso declared. Hashke Jr.'s blood is acknowledged. Today we witness a new beginning. Silas tried to retreat, but his horse stumbled. He fell hard. Clutching his chest, the men around him scattered, but Thomas ran forward, checking Silas's pulse. He's still breathing. Heart attack. Maybe. James knelt beside his brother. Silas's eyes fluttered open, filled with pain and fear. I'm dying, he gasped. Not today, James said. He looked at Garrett. Get him to a doctor, now. As they loaded Silas onto a horse, James met his brother's eyes one last time. I forgive you, he said simply. Silas closed his eyes, tears leaking from the corners. The riders departed, leaving only the Navajo warriors standing in their protective circle. Nezba emerged from the house with both children. Kai's eyes were wide with wonder. Ayasha smiled for the first time since James had known her. Thomas approached his father hesitantly. You could have let him die. Could have, James agreed. But then I'd be the man I was, not the man I'm trying to become. They stood awkwardly, decades of pain between them. This doesn't fix everything, Thomas said. I know, but it's a start. Yeah, James breathed. It's a start. The sun rose fully, flooding the land with golden light, and for the first time in 12 years, James felt something other than guilt. He felt hope. The Navajo stayed, not all of them, but enough. 10 families decided to settle near Nezba's land, creating something that had never existed before, a place where 2 peoples lived side by side, not in tolerance, but in genuine community. They built Nezba a proper house, not the cabin James had imagined, but something larger, sturdy enough to weather storms and time. James worked alongside Thomas and the other men, his aging body protesting, but his spirit stronger than it had been in decades. Kai learned quickly, absorbing skills from both worlds. He could track like his mother's people and calculate property lines like Preston Hayes. The boy had inherited his father's intelligence and his mother's resilience. Ayasha spoke her first words during the house raising. She pointed at James and said clearly, Grandfather. The work stopped. Everyone turned. Nezba pressed her hand to her mouth. James had to sit down, overcome. The financial situation resolved itself in unexpected ways. The Navajo brought livestock, 200 sheep and 50 cattle as payment for the land they'd been given. Not charity, but trade. Dignified exchange between equals. It was enough to satisfy the bank, barely, but enough. Silas survived his heart attack, but emerged changed. The doctors told him he had perhaps a year, maybe less. His debts were revealed during his recuperation, the gambling, the desperation, the deals with dangerous men. James visited him once. They sat on Silas's porch, 2 brothers who'd wasted decades on rivalry and resentment. I poisoned Nesba's husband, Salas confessed, Hasty and Yazzie. I needed their land for the mining rights. I put rat poison in his food at the trading post, watched him die slowly over 6 months. Could James absorb this quietly? The confirmation of what he'd suspected. You should turn me in, Silas said. The tribe already knows. They've decided your punishment, which is banishment. You leave the territory, never return. Silas nodded slowly. That's more mercy than I deserve. Maybe, James agreed, but mercy's all we've got left. Before Silas left town, he signed over his property claims to James, not everything he kept enough to live on, but the contested parcels, the ones he'd tried to steal. You were always the better man, Silas said, at their final goodbye. I just couldn't see it. I wasn't better, just luckier. I got a second chance. 1 month later, the community gathered for a ceremony. The Navajo blessed the land in their traditional way, with prayers and songs that predated any white settlement. Hasty and So formally adopted James into the tribe, giving him a name, Hastin Agadita, the man who returns. James knelt in the dust as the elder placed his hands on his head and spoke in Navajo. He didn't understand all the words, but he felt their weight, absolution, acceptance, belonging. When he stood, Thomas was watching. Their relationship remained complicated, too much history to simply erase, but they'd begun talking. Short conversations about land management, weather, the children, building a foundation word by word. She's having a baby, Thomas said one evening. Who us? Nesba, due in 6 months. James looked toward her house, where lamplight glowed warm against the darkness. Is it? No, Thomas said firmly. It's Hasty and Yazzie's, conceived before he died. She didn't know until recently. The baby arrived in early spring, a daughter, healthy and squalling with life. Nesba named her Deniba, after the woman James had loved and lost. When Nesba told him the name, James wept openly. Why would you honor her? Because love is never wasted, Nesba said simply. Even love that hurt. It made you into man who could save us. Over time, Thomas and Nesba grew close. It happened gradually, naturally, like water finding its course. He taught her children to ride. She taught him her language more fluently. They shared meals, shared work, shared the burden of survival. 2 years after that dawn, when hundreds of riders appeared, Thomas and Nesba married. The ceremony blended both traditions, Navajo prayers and Christian vows, creating something new. From 2 old worlds, James stood as witness, giving away the bride who had saved him as surely as he'd tried to save her. The circle completed itself in ways he never could have imagined. 5 years after James gave away his land, the settlement had transformed into a small village. 30 families, roughly equal parts Navajo and white settlers, who'd proven themselves tolerant enough to belong. They built a school where children learned English and Navajo both. A church stood near a traditional kiva, the 2 structures sharing the same dusty plaza. No one found it strange anymore. James was 60 now, nearly blind from the diabetes that had finally claimed his sight. But he didn't need eyes to know his way around. The land had become part of him, every rock and tree memorized through decades of careful attention. He lived in a small house near Nesba's family, considered grandfather to all the children in the village. Kai, now 13, read to him every evening. Ayasha, 10 years old and wonderfully talkative, told him stories she was writing down so they wouldn't be forgotten. Thomas visited regularly. They still didn't embrace. Perhaps they never would, but they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the children play, and that was enough. One afternoon, James walked to the creek with Thomas guiding his steps. They sat beside Hashke Jr.'s grave, which now had a proper headstone that read, Hashke Jr., beloved son, forgiven and remembered. "Do you think he'd understand?" James asked. "What I tried to do here. I think he'd see a man who spent 12 years punishing himself, then spent 5 years making something good from the ashes. Is that enough? It's more than a most manage." They sat until sunset. James couldn't tell the colors anymore, but Thomas described them. Gold bleeding into orange, then purple, then the deep blue of coming night. "I'm dying," James said quietly. "I know. Not today, maybe not for a few months, but soon." "Are you afraid?" James considered this. "No, not anymore. I spent so long wanting to die. Now that it's coming, I'm just grateful. Grateful I lived long enough to see this." He gestured broadly at the village, the life they'd built. "I'm glad you stayed," Thomas said. Simple words, but they held 25 years of pain and reconciliation. "So am I, son. So am I." As darkness fell, they walked back together. Lamplight glowed from houses where families gathered for evening meals. Children's laughter carried on the wind. Somewhere, someone was singing a Navajo lullaby that James had learned by heart, though he couldn't translate the words. He'd thought he was giving away land. Turned out he'd been finding home. Not the home he'd lost, but something better. Something earned through sacrifice and sustained through community. Something that would outlive him that night. James sat on his porch one last time, listening to the sounds of the village settling into sleep. Nesba brought him soup and sat with him for a while, not speaking, just sharing presence. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For letting a broken man try to fix something." "You fix everything," she said softly. "You fix us. You fix your son. You fix yourself." "I don't know about that last part." "I know," she said with certainty. "You fix yourself. When you give land away, that day, you become whole." After she left, James sat in the darkness he could no longer see and felt peace settle over him like a blanket. He'd been given one last chance, and somehow, impossibly, he hadn't wasted it. That was enough. That was everything. James was 55 when he found his purpose. 55 when he discovered that giving away what he treasured most actually gave him everything he'd been missing. He'd spent decades carrying guilt, believing he was too broken to matter, too late to make things right. But one decision, one moment of choosing compassion over safety, changed not just his life, but generations that followed. How many of us carry debts we think we can never repay? How many of us believe our best years are behind us? That the mistakes we made have permanently defined who we are? James proved something profound. It's never too late to become who you were meant to be. The land he gave away became a home. The stranger he helped became family. The son who left came back. Not because everything was perfect, but because one man finally stood for something bigger than his own comfort. Sometimes our greatest legacy isn't what we accumulate, but what we're willing to release, what we give when we have nothing left to give. That's when we discover what we're really worth. What debt from your past still weighs on you? Is there someone in your life right now who needs you to be there? James, share your thoughts. Below your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.